thank you for that lovely introduction, and I hope I can do it justice. It really is a privilege to be here tonight in such a lovely setting. Thank you all for coming and taking this tour of the Western Mediterranean with me tonight. So we're going to take a deep dive into this beautiful landscape of the Western Mediterranean, spangling with colour, spring flowers, crisp cistus flowers and shimmering leaves, and it's going to be really, really beautiful. So I'm looking forward to you joining me on this virtual tour that we're going to have. I'll start off in the talk with why the Western Mediterranean, so what makes this place outstanding and why I've decided to dedicate so much time to looking at it. We're then going to look a little bit about the places where these plants grow and some of the selection pressures that they face, which will help us to understand how the plants have evolved to be like they are. So we'll look at some of the habitats in which these plants grow. And then I'm going to talk about some of my favourite places to actually see these wildflowers, which I've chosen very carefully because the message I'd like to give is that you don't actually have to travel very far at all to see these wonderful plants, and one of the best floristic regions in the world, in fact. And then we'll look at the plants themselves, and we'll start off with some of the sclerophylls, the spiny vegetation that's so typical of this part of the world, and then the geophytes, the little bulbous plants, which the Mediterranean is so famous for. And then we're going to look a little bit at some of the modes of nutrition, which will become clearer when I talk about it, but some of the interesting ways in which these plants have evolved to survive in these hostile conditions, and then a little bit on the mating systems as well. So those are the topics I'm going to talk about tonight. And I just wanted to start off with these two iconic plants of the Mediterranean because they're just so beautiful. The one on my left here, Pancratium maritimum, the sea daffodil, is very characteristic of dune systems right across the Mediterranean basin. And I think people often think of this plant as being an exotic introduction that isn't meant to be there. And it isn't. It's native. It's just a very flamboyant, beautiful sea daffodil that grows on the dune systems across the Mediterranean. And then the other is this one, a Mediterranean sea squill, Drimia maritima. Both of these are sort of late summer to autumn flowering perennials, which anyone who's been to the Mediterranean at that time of year is likely to have seen those. So those, I think, are some of the most beautiful plants that you have in the Western Mediterranean. In terms of Mediterranean climate regions then, we're broadly speaking talking about 5 across the world, so around California, Chile, the Mediterranean basin, of which we're going to talk about the West tonight, South Africa and Western Australia. And all of these Mediterranean climate regions are associated with large subtropical high-pressure cells, which means they're characterized by warm to very hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. And that's contributed to the richness of this incredible flora that we see in the Mediterranean basin today. And the vegetation that's so typical of this part of the world, seen in this photo here, is variously known as Macky, Matorral, Chaparral, Feinboss and Bush, depending on where you are in the world. But it looks very similar. And anyone who's been to any of these places and has seen this vegetation will know that superficially it looks quite similar actually from the surface of things, whether you're in the coast of Western Australia, Chile, California, South Africa or the Mediterranean basin itself. And the vegetation at a first glance appears to be quite similar, even sometimes the leaf morphology of some of these plants. And this is due to a convergence of evolution because the plants in all these areas are subject to the same hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters, and they've had to adapt to cope with these hostile conditions, particularly drought stress, and that's why they look quite similar. So looking at the habitats then, so the first habitat that I'd like to talk about is Macky, which is arguably one of the most important habitats in the Mediterranean basin. And this is characterized by this spiny, sclerophyllous, so-called tough vegetation. And anyone who's tried walking through this will know what I mean. It really is difficult to walk through these bushes without impaling yourself on thorns and bristles and things. And these sclerophylls, these tough, spiny plants, are very well adapted with their thick, waxy cuticles and their often reduced leaves and their hairy outer coating. This is all an adaptation to cope with the long, hot, dry summers and weeks of baking under that hot Mediterranean sun, often with very little rainfall at all. So we often see these drought-resistant shrubs, like this one here, this Arbutus unado, the strawberry tree, which is quite common in some of the more acidic parts of the Macky vegetation, particularly with a greater level of humus on top of the rock. And then these shrubs in the pea family, the Fabaceae, like this Spartium here, a relative of the broom, and that's this Calicotome villosa, which is a nasty thing to walk through, a very, very thorny bush indeed. But it is well worth a walk through this vegetation if you're feeling brave, because the plants are fascinating, and actually they have a very rich understory of little perennials, shrubs, annuals and geophytes in the spring and the autumn. And walking through this vegetation is a real experience, not just to look at, but actually the smell. All of these plants are very strongly aromatic. You have lots of rosemary, thyme, those sticky cistus, like the cistus ladanifer we'll look at in a minute. And all of these combine to make this heady aroma, a cocktail of different spicy and herby scents in the Macky vegetation. So this is just a picture of some Macky vegetation in northern Spain, which is very, very typical of this part of the world. And in the foreground, you've got some Pistacia lentiscus, which is the mastic bush, which is ubiquitous across the Mediterranean. It's one of these few plants that remains green when everything else dries up and turns brown in the driest parts. And then you've got relatives of the sea buckthorn, the sort of the rhamnus poking through, and then integrating with these pines, probably Pinus pinasta at the back here. So this is typical of Macky vegetation on a terra rossa, that red characteristic bedrock of soil that you get. And then these little rocky outcrops here that if you walk through the vegetation, you can find some really interesting surprises. Little bee orchids, tongue orchids and things like that poking through underneath in the understory. And these are some of the plants that you get in the Macky vegetation. So we see lots of junipers, like this Juniperus oxycedrus here. And then these lovely examples. This one, the gardeners amongst us will recognise as well, Cistus ladanifer, the gum cistus. It has really sticky leaves, and it's been used in the perfume industry, and it's so aromatic. I can't describe the scent, but it's a sort of spicy, perfumey smell that's unmistakable. And it wafts through the April and May breeze down the hillsides in southern Portugal and southern Spain. Obviously, I'm transporting us from this autumnal, cold UK evening, or doing my best to. And it really is a lovely, lovely plant that actually, incidentally, does quite well in the southeast of England in a dry border. And then some of these gorse relatives as well, like this Genista hirsuta, this characteristic yellow that you see on the hillsides. And if you go to anywhere in the southern Iberian Peninsula or parts of eastern Spain, you'll see whole hillsides covered in smudges of yellow where some of these genistas and their close relatives are ablaze with colour and just humming with bees. You'll also often hear this habitat being referred to, which is the garrigue, again from the French. Some people use the term interchangeably with Macky, and it does integrate into this habitat and is quite similar. But technically speaking, this is a much more low-lying, often weather-beaten form of the Macky that's under a metre tall. And this is the sort of vegetation that you get on coastal cliffs. So these areas that are blasted by sea gales in winter and wind, and then baked dry in summer. And the plants have to be really, really tough that grow here. And they're really jostling together against the elements. You often see similar plants to those of the Macky vegetation, although in a more stunted form. Some of the taxonomists in some parts of the area like to sort of pick these apart, and some are described as different species, but many of them are genetically probably quite similar, although they do look quite different. And then we see some other plants creeping in, like the little myrtle bushes, this Polenis spinosa, a prickly little member of the daisy family, the Asteraceae. And then some of the mint family, which are very common, so this Teucrium, many of which are again very, very aromatic. So many of the plants in this part of the world smell so very strong and contribute to this wonderful fragrant cocktail of aromas that you get when you walk across these cliff tops. And some of the plants we see here are these beautiful helichrysums, the curry plants. Again, anyone who's interested in gardening will know these very well. And then again, some of the Teucriums, also members of the mint family, such as this one, Teucrium balearicum. And I really like this one because, like many plants in the Mediterranean, it forms these dense hedgehog-like cushions to protect it against desiccation. And they sit out these long, hot summers with very few leaves, a sort of silvery, reflective covering that reflects maximum light, and a covering of tiny little hairs. And all of these are adaptations to protect it from simply drying out. And in the spring, these bushes are actually covered in white little flowers, and they look like someone described to me once as little sheep nestling on the hillside, which I think is quite nice. Agricultural land is a very important habitat. When we think of agricultural land in the UK, the first thing that's conjured up in my mind, at least, is sort of arable farming and fields. But agriculture, when it's managed sympathetically and with a low intensity in the Mediterranean, is quite different and very, very important because it supports a very rich flora all of its own. And there are half a dozen or so very important species in agriculture in the Mediterranean that are not only cultivated, but they sort of naturalise in and amongst the Macky vegetation. And it's hard to know which ones have been planted and which ones have escaped. And that's how they grow. One of them you'll notice if you go to the Mediterranean is the carob, Ceratonia siliqua. And this is a member of the pea family as well. So it's one of these dark green sort of bushy trees, and again it's one of the few that will keep its colour throughout the year. And in the spring you'll see these bright green pods that turn black later in the year, and it produces these peculiar flowers which are a separation of the sexes. I think it's androdioecious, this one, but in any case you see a separation of the sexes of the flowers, and they sprout directly from the trunk of the tree. So it's one that you actually have to peer into the foliage to actually find the flowers on this plant. It's a process called cauliflory. And the very word carat, which denotes a unit of mass for gold, actually derives from this plant. Interestingly, because the seeds within this fruit, within this pod here, are very uniform in their size, and it was seen as a very appropriate benchmark, if you like, for measuring the weight of gold because of the uniformity of the seed size. And that's where the name carat is derived from the carob, in fact. And it really has a very ancient history. There are even hieroglyphs of this plant meaning sweetness. And it's been cultivated for many centuries, and more recently as a chocolate substitute as well. And the reason it's so important is because it doesn't really require any intensive agriculture. So you don't need to spray it with things, you don't need to feed it, you can just let it sit there and do its own thing. It supports an abundance of wildlife around it, as does often the olive when it's managed sympathetically. This is a picture of an olive grove in Tuscany, which I think is just really beautiful. And of course it's been cultivated since antiquity, and it's so important. And the very word oil in many languages, I understand, actually comes from this very tree. And it still has a lot of significance in religious ceremonies locally in the Mediterranean today. And we even refer to it probably without even thinking in everyday language, such as an olive branch, for example, as a symbol of peace. Very, very important crop in the Mediterranean, both economically and ecologically. Supporting a huge flora in its understory. So this will probably be covered in cyclamen flowers and little crocuses in the autumn, as well as a plethora of spring flowers and annuals in March and April. And the almond is another one of this handful of important crops which I mentioned. Very recognisable, a sort of spiny habit, fresh green leaves, and these furry fruits known as drupes. Native to the Mediterranean. Some of the wild forms are inedible. I haven't actually tried them, to be honest, but they cultivate the sweet ones. And it's important internationally, but particularly in the Mediterranean. And they manage the pollination where they grow it with beekeepers. Lovely little tree, very common across the Mediterranean. And of course the fig, one of the first ever plants to be cultivated, which I believe actually predates wheat, barley and some of the legumes as well, and has been widely cultivated from Portugal through to Afghanistan. This is one growing on a hillside in Portugal. And the fig has its origins in the Latin word ficus, as well as from Hebrew as well. And it has a very interesting inflorescence, which you could give a whole talk on in and of itself, called a syconium, the fruit that develops from this inflorescence. The actual flowers themselves are embedded within the fig. I would encourage you, if you haven't done it before, to open up a fig and have a look, preferably with a hand lens, at the minute flowers, because they're fascinating. Little tiny wasps oviposit, or lay their little eggs within the tiny capsules within the syconium and affect pollination for the plant. So a lovely plant, the fig. And again, you can see this is how it grows in amongst all the other vegetation in the landscape. And citrus, which tends to be managed a little bit, or cultivated a little bit more intensively. You typically associate it with citrus groves. That wonderful smell that you get when you drive past a citrus grove, nothing compares with it, particularly in the south of Spain, in the south of Portugal in the spring. Anyone who's driven alongside that and had the windows down, it's just, it's something to remember. It's actually native to Asia, and the ancestor that I'll show in a minute, Citrus medica, was probably introduced from India to Greece, Turkey, and the Eastern Mediterranean. There are now numerous cultivars, and Spain is a very big exporter of its citriculture, and a very, very important economic crop in the Mediterranean. This is the citron, if you don't know it. That fruit is absolutely enormous. The photo doesn't do it justice. They're huge. They're like melons hanging from the tree, and very commonly grown in Sicily, in fact, as are a lot of lemons. It's relative, of course. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of a flavour of some of the agriculture in the Mediterranean and how, when sympathetically managed, it's such an important reservoir for wildflowers. As are oak forests. The holm oak, I don't have a picture of one, Quercus ilex, from the ancient word for holly, grows often in pure or mixed stands. There are some lovely stands of it in central Italy, and a very important refuge for certain species of orchids, some wonderful forest floor plants that grow in amongst the holm oaks. More of those later. And then the cork oak. So this is the cork oak here. Very distinctive for its peeled back bark. You can see where this one's been harvested and it's exposed the trunk at the bottom here. Cork oak stands are fantastic refuges for wildflowers because, just like some of the other examples I mentioned before, no one really does anything. So no one has to spray them with fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides. They're just allowed to sit in all their glory, and all the plants grow amongst them. And you find some fascinating things, lovely cistus bushes under here, a range of different orchids and perennials. It's a fantastic hunting ground for anyone interested in plants. Portugal is a massive exporter of cork, as anyone who's been there probably knows. Down in the Alentejo and the Algarve, there are vast stands of cork oaks, which are very interesting for botanising. Lovely gnarled old cork trees there, and also in certain pockets in parts of North Africa and further east as well, you see smaller plantations of them. I always try to buy wine with corks in rather than plastic ones to try and encourage this wonderful form of agriculture and its ecological significance that it carries. And you also get a very interesting fauna in certain parts of the Iberian Peninsula, such as this lovely lynx that lives in amongst the cork oaks there. Pines are also very iconic, I suppose, of the Mediterranean. It sort of conjures up that wonderful resinous smell that you get sitting under a pine tree in the Mediterranean. This Aleppo pine, Pinus halepensis, is particularly common. This is the one that you typically see flanking rocky ledges that go down to the sea. Very characteristic Mediterranean tree. And then the maritime pine, Pinus pinasta, is often the one that you see whole forests of it planted. It's often planted for timber. There are some concerns about the replacement of some of the other habitats with large stands of pine, in them forming sort of ecological deserts, but then they're also, particularly when they grow intermixed with other vegetation, a very interesting reservoir for certain species of wildflowers, all of their own. Eucalypts, another controversial tree that isn't native to the Mediterranean, but native to Australia, of course. Very well adapted for sitting out in the long, hot, dry summers under the Mediterranean sun, and they do very well in the Mediterranean. They're cultivated for pulp and paper because they realise quick profits. and they have potential for biomass as well. So they're commonly cultivated, particularly in parts of the west coast of the Iberian Peninsula, down the coast of Portugal and in parts of Spain as well. Interestingly, I've never looked at this quantitatively. However, my own experiences, I've actually found lots of very, very interesting plants indeed in amongst eucalyptus plantations. So I do wonder, it'll be interesting to understand what the impact of these is. In particular, this glorious carnivorous plant, more on that later, Drosophilum, seems to have an affinity actually for eucalyptus plantations in my experience. Acacias as well, they may look beautiful, but we don't like these because they're not actually native to the environment, though they look pretty. And driving along roadsides in March and April, you could be forgiven for liking them, but some of them really are nasty in terms of their behaviour. So they escape and get out into the vegetation and displace other plants. Some of them are actually classified as invasive by law and apparently prohibited their planting, but you wouldn't think so from most of the places I go. And in fact, this is a photo I took recently of an Acacia cyclops, which certainly from what I've seen seems to be on the increase. I don't remember seeing this a few years ago, but there are certain incursions that seem to be popping up over the Mediterranean, and some of these plants can wreak havoc. The Mediterranean is a lovely place to do gardening, and people grow all sorts of wonderful things, but some of them, unfortunately, get a little bit too at home and they escape and can cause problems. Aquatic habitats are not something we traditionally associate with the Mediterranean, but they are there and they're very important, and they're often associated with rivers and reservoirs or seasonal lakes. Even in the driest parts of the Iberian Peninsula, you often have lakes that and lagoons that are flooded in winter, sort of wet in spring, and then may or may not dry up completely in the summer. And they host their own very interesting flora. Interestingly, for the field botanist, many of the plants are very similar to our own North European flora because they're adapted much better to grow in these damp conditions than they would, of course, on the Macky or the Garrigue vegetation. And it's also a good hunting ground for some of these interesting plants, such as these Serapeus, the tongue orchids. And there are certain places where I've seen swathes and swathes of these growing in their thousands in about March or April time. Not typically associated with aquatic habitats, but some of them do seem to really like growing in these very wet conditions. Sadly, it's also where I've seen evidence of them being dug up and probably sold on the internet, which is a very sad thing. You also get some other interesting plants which the field botanists from Northern Europe amongst us will recognise, such as these Utricularias, which are carnivores. So these plants grow in mineral and nutrient impoverished environments, particularly in acidic or alkaline lakes with low levels of nutrients. And they produce these tiny, this is a magnified trap here, which little tiny microorganisms in the water, little water fleas and the like, they touch these trigger hairs, which causes a little trap door to open and suck water into the vacuum that is within the trap and the unfortunate little microorganism with it, and then closing the door on its way in, and then the poor unhappy creature is digested and supplements the diet of the Utricularia. So this one has a little bit of a sinister life history. It's not particularly common in the Mediterranean, but you will find it in some of the bigger water systems, and you can also find these occasionally in some of the bigger wetland systems here in the UK as well. And by contrast, there are the very bare and arid habitats. These are the ones I find particularly fascinating, actually. So the Mediterranean Garrigue and Macky habitats that we already looked at, they cover most of the Western Mediterranean. But they do, of course, border some of the semi-deserts and the deserts, particularly in the far south of this phytogeographic region that we're talking about today. Down into North Africa, the Atlantic succulent thicket flora, and also into southeast Spain, which is a flora that's very similar to that of North Africa. And that's where you find a sort of mosaic of these, not only the Mediterranean species, but also some of the desert species that intermingle with some of the more common Mediterranean plants. And you get these very interesting xerophytes, these very drought-tolerant plants, such as this one. This is Sueda ifnensis, which is predominantly North African chenopode, or more correctly now in the Amaranthaceae for the systematists amongst us, and I know there are some in the audience, so I'll be careful. And also this Launea, which I think has a lovely architecture to its stems. This one starts off as a rosette of herbaceous leaves and looks quite unlike the adult form. And by the time it's produced this adult shrub-like form, it's lost all its leaves, and it just sits as a sort of tangle of these intricately interesting geometry of spines, I suppose you could call it, well, stems really. And that's Launea arborescens, I think, which grows down in the really hottest parts. And down by Murcia and in the southeast of Spain, it's one of the subdominant species. And there you also find this Anabasis, which I think always reminds me of a little mound of coral. And this one's much more at home in the driest parts of Syria, actually, than it is in the Western Mediterranean, but it does make its way into some of the really dry, barren parts, such as this, taken in the Tabernas Desert, and you can really get the flavour for what these poor plants have to endure. So I promised a little virtual tour, so let's go on one. So we're going to start off with one of my favourite places, a place that's very close to my heart, which is the Algarve. I said at the beginning of the talk, I really wanted to make sure that I get across that you really don't have to go very far to see some of these wonderful plants. The Mediterranean in spring is very accessible. We're very lucky with how easy it is to get to, and you really don't have to go far to see some of these fantastic plants. And the Algarve is one of these places. So this is the Algarve in southern Portugal. Most people, or a lot of holiday makers, I should say, sort of fly into Faro, and then many get no further than some of these sheltered coasts, coves, which are very beautiful on the sort of Terra Rossa soil with the turquoise sea, which I should point out, technically speaking, is Atlantic, of course, but from a phytogeographical point of view, the vegetation is very much Mediterranean and much more akin with that of North Morocco, so you can forgive me for including it. And then we have the low-lying littoral, as it's known, which is the coastal, and particularly this seabelt up on the Atlantic here, which you've got some very important dune systems and shale cliffs, integrating up into the Barracal, which is a local name, I suppose, for the Macky vegetation, which is in Portuguese is known as Matos, and then up into the Serra, these hills around Monchique, where you have plantations of eucalyptus, but more importantly, of other oaks and interesting trees. And each of these three areas has its own different sort of flora, I suppose, that intermingles with one another, and it's got some fantastic endemics. And this is what the Algarve looks like in the spring, and you can see now why I say it's such a wonderful place to go. All these lovely chrysanthemums, the Glebionis, on a roadside in March, and this is what much of the Algarve looks like. Many people get to see it in sort of July and August, when it's quite a different place, to be honest. And Cape St Vincent, and if anyone hasn't been here and is interested in plants, unforgivable, you have to go. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. So this is Cape St Vincent, which juts out into the Atlantic. It has a fascinating geology, which I'm not a geologist, so I won't pretend to be one, but it has this sort of limestone formation in which it has a legacy from tidal waves that have dumped their burden of sand on top of this big plateau. So you actually have sand dunes on top of a rocky cliff top that you get the halophytes, the salt-tolerant plants, some more of the xerophytic shrubs, those drought-tolerant plants, the little bulbs, the annuals, and they all come together in the spring to form this riot of colour, absolutely ablaze. And there's a succession from whites and blues through to yellows and pinks over the course of, well, sometimes the end of February, but at least through to the middle of April, sometimes May. But in the first 2 weeks of April, you will always see a riot of colour on here. And it's a veritable rock garden. These lovely Thymus camphoratus that only grows in the Algarve, this relative of the cistus, Helimium, Calicinum, and various other thrifts and all sorts of interesting things growing in here. And I've walked on this for many a day on this peninsula, and I probably have found something different every time I've done that walk. I said I was only going to talk about accessible places. I lied. This is Silene rothmalarii, which grows on just a few very inaccessible shale ledges in the Algarve. I wouldn't recommend looking for this one without a list of disclaimers. It grows on this little precipice, and there are only a few hundred plants of this left. It really is a rarity, very special plant. And every time I go and look for it, another little bit of its poor habitat has crumbled and fallen into the sea. But I guess it's always grown on these shale cliffs, and that's what it likes best, and hopefully it will be with us for a long time to come. And then these lovely little Linnarias, which are actually very tiny. Relatives, of course, of the snapdragon, Linnaria algarviana, which just grows around the Costa Vicentina, a little annual that comes up after the winter rains, and little purple patches. And this one, Linnaria ficculhoana, which only grows on a few sand dunes along the Costa Vicentina. Lovely, lovely little plants. And this one, a diamond flower that's often cultivated actually, Ionopsidian alkali, but very rare, just grows, you can just about catch it in March if you're lucky, but usually end of Feb, growing on some of the rocky outcrops and the shale and the sand dunes. Lovely place. Now, if we go a little bit further east, unfortunately bypassing some lovely places in the south of Spain because we don't have time, but let's go to Almeria, the opposite end of the south of the Iberian Peninsula, because it may be on a similar latitude, but this place is very, very different because quite simply it bakes. It is so, so hot down here. It really, really is. But before that very reason, it has a fascinating flora. I love the flora of this part of the world. It's home to our only semi-desert, the Tabernas Desert in the south of Spain. And we have the Cabo de Gata, this cape down here as well, with its own unique flora as well. Much more similar to that of North Africa than to the rest of the Mediterranean. And there are some fantastic plants which I'll come on to in a minute. This is the sort of landscape. Bits of it never even get particularly green, even in the winter months if there's not much rain. But it really is beautiful. These lovely sort of cliffs going down into the turquoise water. It's beautiful. And you have these wonderful geophytes after the winter rains, like this Androcymbium, very rare. You only get that around this area, actually, in Europe, much more common in North Africa. And then some of these shrubs, like this interesting Periploca, one of these ones that's able to sit out the long hot summers, and it looks practically dead by the end of August, but then it comes to life again in the winter rains. And this is a relative of it, also in the Sclepediaceae family. This is our sort of only resident cactus-like plant. Of course, it isn't a cactus, but it's evolved under very similar selection pressures to look like one, with these wonderful starfish-like flowers. This is Caralluma europea, and this grows just in a few places down on the driest, rockiest parts of the Mediterranean, near a lighthouse on the Cabo de Gata. It just about creeps into Europe in the really hot, dry bits. And this is the Tabernas, the semi-desert of Europe, and isn't it just? So this is where they filmed some of the Indiana Jones films, actually, and you can well understand why. And it looks, from the naked eye, pretty similar at most times of the year. It never really gets to be particularly green. However, after a very good winter rain, you can see lots of beautiful little purple, particularly, and some white and yellow annuals and perennials growing in the spring, in around March time. And this fantastic plant, which I love, Cinnamorium, which I'll come on to more a little bit later, and some of these sea lavenders, Limonium. So on to Majorca, and moving too much, on to Majorca, one of the largest, the largest Balearic islands with an extremely rich flora. Some of the areas you can forget about, botanically speaking, but some of them are just fantastic. Some wonderful wetlands up here, and then on this northern seaboard, all these rocky peninsulas, there are some great plants. And my favourite area is Cap de Formentor, where you have these wonderful halophytes at the base of the cliff, which are subject to salt spray, intermingled with some of the lovely shrubs perched up on the cliffs. Asphodels flowering in the spring, the lovely white flowers that are so pretty, and you get so many rarities. You cannot do a walk on this peninsula without spotting an endemic every 5 minutes. It's just fantastic. Such as the Aristolochia bianorii, which only grows around these parts. Lovely little birthwort with its fascinating stripy flowers. That grows in these rocky parts. And then this monster here, the dead horse arum, so I'll save that for another slide in a minute. And this one, Arum pictum, which starts to flower in the autumn, up in the pine forest near some of the, you can easily find it near some of the car parking spaces on the Cap de Formentor. Lovely. This one, a little foxglove digitalis minor. I don't know if it's in cultivation, but it should be if it isn't, because it's beautiful. Like a little version of our more familiar foxglove, often grows precariously up on the bits that you annoyingly can't reach to photograph, but it's a beautiful plant nonetheless. And some of these endemic shrubs like this Hypericum and the astragalus that I mentioned earlier. And these are plants that only grow in this part of the world. So again, bypassing, unfortunately, some very interesting areas, but onto another area, the Maremma Park. So I love this particular place because of its sheer diversity. So this is in Tuscany. You don't have to go far to get here. And all in one place, you've got pine forests, swamps, salt marshes, coastal dunes, garrigue, you name it, it's got it. Huge number of endemics, some really interesting plants. And it's a beautiful place to walk. So this is the south of the Maremma, which looks a little bit more typical of parts of the Aegean region and the eastern Mediterranean with its rolling hillsides and vegetation down to the sea. And then these are some of the interesting Pinea plantations, the umbrella pine, the source of the pine nut. And you'll see whole swathes of this in the Maremma Park with these artificial ancient this sort of irrigation system, I believe, with its little swamps and lagoons and all of them with their own little interesting flora in there. You could spend a week here and not get bored. Little endemic crocus that grows here, Crocus etruscus as well. And then these are some of the lovely plants that are common here. Couldn't do a talk on the Western Mediterranean without sticking a giant fennel in here. Ferula glauca, this one probably, rather than Ferula communis. Its relative Ferula communis is the common giant fennel that interestingly seems to be popping up all over parts of our motorways. So look out for it in sort of April time off the M25. I've seen a few, and you can't miss it. It's huge. So that's making itself at home in our warmest parts of the UK. It's a lovely plant that sort of sits as a rosette of feathery foliage for a good few years, and then when it's got enough reserves, it sends up these gigantic inflorescences of yellow flowers in the spring. Very statuesque and very familiar in this part of the world. And on to Puglia, and again, a little bit of a disclaimer here because the flora is not typically Western Mediterranean and much more similar to that of the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, this is the eastern extreme of the phytogeographic region, if we can be forgiven for defining it so. So a little bit more like parts of the Balkans and Greece, but nonetheless very, very interesting and an orchid lover's paradise. Orchid lovers make their pilgrimage to this part of the world, well, maybe not in their thousands, maybe in their hundreds, I don't know, to find some of these ophris, these lovely bee orchids, which I'll come on to at the end of the talk. And then if we come back round again a little bit to Sicily, which we have to include as the largest of the Mediterranean islands, because again, such a diversity of habitats. And the reason Sicily is so interesting from a floristic point of view is that we have a real juxtaposition here of parts of North African flora, very similar floristic links to that of Tunisia. Some of the Eastern Mediterranean plants creep in here, particularly those of more similar to the Greek islands, as well as the northern Mediterranean, so more similar to that of Sardinia, Corsica and parts of Italy. And they all come together in this great mixing pot of an island. And you've got these lovely hills up here, the Madoniae Hills. I would recommend the drive actually from Catania through the centre of Italy, because although it's quite barren, it looks a little bit more like the Canary Islands because of its volcanic nature, but some fascinating plants that grow there, really, really interesting. These are some of the more eastern Mediterranean ones, I suppose. This is Sarcopeterium spinosa, a member of the rose family, believe it or not. This is what strong selection pressure will do to a plant. Looks much more like a gorse and is more of an Eastern Mediterranean species, much more common in sort of the Greek islands, I suppose, than it is here, but it makes its way into Sicily. And then this lovely little Antirrhinum siculum, which is the Sicilian Antirrhinum, which you can find in the south of Sicily, growing out of all of the old buildings, the amphitheatres. It's a lovely plant. And of course, Mount Etna itself, so not quite dissimilar to the rest of the Mediterranean flora. These plants are adapted to growing on these volcanic slopes and outcrops, and you could do a whole talk on these in itself because there's such a diversity of plants there. I was in Sicily a couple of weeks ago and lucky enough to see some of the autumn flora. So even in September and October, there are things of interest, like this lovely Colchicum bivonii with its checkered petals. That grows in abandoned agricultural fields. The cyclamen, heterofolium, whole woods of that up in the Madoniae. It's just beautiful, all covered in pink on the roadsides. I also stopped off to look at this Sternbergia, these little splashes of yellow that you have on the roadside. And I was affronted with the strong smell of animal dung, and I actually knew exactly what I was looking for before I found it, which is this. This is the culprit, which was growing right next to it, Biarum tenuifolium. And this snake-like spadix tells us it's in the arum family. And this plant smells of animal dung to attract similar insects to those little midges that you find around cowpats, I suppose. And they crawl into a little floral chamber underground and carry out the pollination for the flower. So I stopped to look at this and then found something much more interesting, which is often the way in the Mediterranean. Moving on, so I won't dwell on classification, but just to talk about some of the challenges for the field botanist. So very traditionally, botany, of course, was based on morphology, so what a plant looks like, which is not a particularly objective way of classifying plants. The reason being that, as we've seen already, selection pressures drive groups of plants to appear to be very similar when they're not necessarily closely related. A classic example being the cacti and the euphorbias. I almost forgot which are which. These are the cacti, I think, and these are the euphorbias, but that's how similar they look. So if you pick up a flora that was written 10 years ago, you're very likely to find a disparity in which family a given plant is ascribed to, and many have been transferred to another. And some of the very people who are responsible for all this work are actually sitting in the audience today. So, for example, a snapdragon I've better get this right now. It's now in the Plantaginaceae rather than the Scophilariaceae as we would traditionally think of it. So it's much more closely related to a plant that you may not have thought it was, i.e. a plantain. And there are some whopping examples of how wrong botanists got this. A classic, or my favourite, being this little Mediterranean parasite, Cytinus, grows within the tissues of its host. It's an endophytic parasite, grows on cistus bushes. And it was believed, I think because people didn't really know where on earth to put it, to be closely related to this monster, the largest flower on earth, of course, Rafflesia, which it is not related to. This is actually now known to be a relative of the euphorbias, which, ironically, if that's the correct use of the word, actually produces very minute flowers. So that's just how wrong this could be, and that's why it's important that we use an objective means of classification. And again, I won't dwell on this, but some of the work we've done shows that you even have to look closer than that to look at the level of speciation in these plants. So Elizabeth said at the beginning, I'm interested in speciation, and I am. And different Cytinus populations actually show very clear patterns of host specificity. So they don't all grow equally on different hosts. You can see a relative abundance of well, you can't actually, but I'll tell you the relative abundance of the parasite on the different species of hosts at different sites shows that they do show host preference. And we know from looking at Orobanchi, the broom rapes, that they actually form distinct genetic groups. So they're actually becoming genetically isolated on different host plants with different ecologies, and that's driving their speciation. So it really isn't as simple as just picking up a flora, looking at the morphology and trying to identify a plant. There's so much more to it than that. Moving on to some alien exotics, because it would be remiss not to talk about them. The algarves are the century plants, which are very characteristic. They're native to Central and North America. Called century plants because I believe it was once thought that they lived for a century and then flowered. It's more like 10 to 30 years or so, depending on where they're growing. And then they produce these enormous inflorescences that people probably think are trees, but they're not. This is the floral structure, which if you go out in a greenhouse will shatter the glass of your greenhouse. And they're cultivated for tequila and relatives of this one anyway, and various other things. And they're grown for ornament. And you see those all across the Mediterranean, as is this one, this relative, Algarvia tenuata, with its lovely winter flowering inflorescences, very unusual. And these beautiful Madonna lilies, this is a photo from Sicily a few weeks ago. You can see the cyclamens in the background. Again, this is native of South Africa, but very commonly grown, particularly in Italy. And you see this as a picked flower in little shrines and on the altars of churches as well. Very beautiful plant. But this is another, a nasty one. Again, it looks nice. It isn't. This is Carpobrotus edulis, the Hottentot fig. it really does form horrible monospecific zones or ecological deserts, and you can see it choking out all the native flora. It's a horrible thing. This is what it does. So it looks nice in the spring, granted, but then in the summer this is what it looks like, and all of the lovely native flora that was growing here now no longer can. I believe it's also prohibited to plant this one, and I think it's also planted very regularly, but it's a horrible plant in the Mediterranean basin. And the prickly pear, of course, so native to the Americas and planted very commonly as a sort of hedging plant. There are a few of these knocking around the Mediterranean. A little bit complicated actually taxonomically, but this is the most common one that you'll find. Moving on, the Chlorophyll. So I alluded to these earlier. These are the plants that sit out the long hot summers. They're often very resinous, hairy, often grey-leaved to reflect maximum light, and classic examples being the cistus bushes. And by the time you see them sort of dried up in the summer, they're not particularly spectacular, but this is what they look like in the spring when they are. This is just a root system, a photo I took of a Linnaea arborescens, and look how big those roots are to cope with these dry conditions. But some of the other plants have evolved other means of sitting out these long hot summers, such as the Drimia again, the sea squill. It produces these giant football-like sized bulbs. They're huge, with these broad strap-shaped leaves in the spring. These then wither away, and in the summer you really don't see an awful lot of this. And then after the first summer rains, it starts to send up these wonderful, impossibly high spikes of flowers that look like they're going to topple over, but somehow manage to withstand the worst of the rain and the storms, and they just keep going. And they're magnificent, lovely plants. Very difficult to get them to flower in the UK. They really need a lot of heat. They need that hot, dry summer to get going, as does this one, which grows in leaf very well in the UK, but I've certainly never managed to get it to flower. Pancratium maritimum, the sea daffodil again, doing its thing on the beach in the Mediterranean. Beautiful, beautiful plant. And it really needs to grow quickly. So in the winter rains, these seeds send out little roots. You get these little seedlings that quickly grow through the wet winter months, so that they've got enough reserves to sit through those hot, dry summer months before they start growing again. Of course, I was going to put some slides on parasitic plants. Anyone who knows me knows that I would. My favourite plants, not all of these are from the Mediterranean, admittedly, but this is a fascinating group of plants. So if we're talking about modes of nutrition, have to include these. If anyone wonders what this one is, it's not from the Mediterranean. That's Hydnora africana, one of my favourite plants from South Africa. Absolutely incredible. We have the hemiparasites, which don't look to all intents and purposes like parasitic plants because they have green leaves. So think of them as being like a mistletoe. But they do tap into the nutrient reserves of the plants around them. This lovely Belladia or Bartzia trixago and this Parenticellia, they're both hemiparasites. And then you have the ones that have gone the whole hog, the holoparasites. So these are the sinister vampires of the plant kingdom. They steal all their food from other plants, and some of them, like this cinnamorium that grows in the driest parts of the Mediterranean, has no leaves, no roots, or no true leaves, no true roots, no chlorophyll, and it has no need for them because it steals all of its plant from its nutrition from its host plant. Really fascinating plants. And my favourites are actually the Cistanches, I think. Cistanchi, Philippia and Violacea that grow again in the very hot, dry parts of the Mediterranean that start to flower in March and April. And they're just fantastic. I love these. And of course the brimrapes. Unforgivably, I've heard them described as looking like withered orchids. They don't. They have a beauty all of their own. There's a real diversity of these in the Mediterranean, and we're really just scratching the surface of the relationships among these complicated plants because they're so reduced in their morphology. It's actually quite difficult to tease them apart by looking at them, even with a microscope. And you really need to look at the molecular level as well as what the plants look like and their ecology, and look at all those three things together to start to tease apart these species relationships. And if you're interested, that's what they look like when they grow in a petri dish. These are some ones we grew in the lab. So they're just as remarkable underground as they are above. But they are also pernicious pests in certain parts of the world. So they've made a transition from their local host flora onto the cultivated crops, such as this parsley field here. This is Orobanche crenata, which is absolutely devastating. You can see what happens when it gets going. And the parasite, has a whole field of its favourite host to get chomping on, and you can see how destructive it really can be. and dodders. And the best way to describe a dodder is to show a video if it will work, because it will do it justice, I promise. But hopefully you get a flavour for the sinister nature of this. It is a relative of the bindweed, and you can really appreciate why. Another interesting plant are these mycoheterotrophs. I don't have time to talk too much about them, but a fascinating group because they have a very strange mode of nutrition. You'll see these again in the old textbooks described as saprophytes, which is not quite correct. They actually depend upon a fungus that lives within their roots, and that sort of conveys food to it. So you have effectively a bit of a tritrophic interaction between an orchid, a fungus that lives in a root, and the fungus that feeds on the tree, in simple terms. So it's very, very interesting. And of course the carnivores, Drosophilum lusitanicum, so a relative of the sundew, which has these, just like it has these sticky leaves, which certain insects find irresistible, and they become ensnared in the glue-like substance on the leaves. And that's how it supplements its diet on these nutrient-poor rocks. Very rare. Unfortunately, it suffered a big demise due to plant enthusiasts, probably in the 80s and 90s. But there are still a few pockets where it grows, and some of them, like I said before, interestingly, in some of the places you wouldn't expect. They're certainly not in nature reserves, let's put it that way. And I'll just finish by talking about some of the mating systems, if I may, because these are really fascinating in the Mediterranean as well. So these are the Aristolochias, the birthworts. They look a little bit like the Southeast Asian Nepenthes pitcher plants. They do trap insects, but not for the same reason. So tiny little insects, they crawl down this tube, and you can see here there are downward pointing spines in the tube, which are very easy for an insect to crawl through, but very difficult or impossible for an insect to crawl back up again. And so they become imprisoned in this little chamber in which they're showered with pollen. And then the hairs release, the hairs wither, like they have in this tube here, and then release their prisoners to go away and pollinate another Aristolochia. So a wonderful mating system. But probably the one that wins the prize is this monstrous plant, the dead horse arum. So this one grows up on gull colonies amongst dead chicks and reconstituted food from seagulls, horrible, dirty, smelly places where there are perhaps more bluebottles and flies than there are ever bees, and therefore this plant has capitalised on that. And again, I do have a little video just to show. And of course, it's David Attenborough narrating. So I promised you hillsides bespangled with crocuses, irises and cistus flowers, and I gave you a dead horse arum. So sorry for that. But I just want to finish, and I know I've gone over my time. I just want to finish on this amazing plant because I couldn't not include it. The Ophrys, the bee orchid. A fantastic plant which dupes male solitary bees and wasps into thinking that it's a seductive female. It produces a straight chain hydrocarbon derived from cuticular waxes that you get on all leaves that is in the exact proportions of the sex pheromones of a female insect. And the male insects find this absolutely irresistible, and they therefore try to mate with the flower in an act called pseudocopulation. And through their vigorous attempts to mate with the flower, they inadvertently pick up the pollen from this flower and then dollop it onto another flower. And there's a huge variety, even within a species, as you can see from this figure here. Wonderful, wonderful flowers that they are too. And a very economic means of pollination as well. It may seem very elaborate and expensive, but it's actually much cheaper in a sense to produce these pheromone mimics than it ever would be to make nectar. And it's also a highly efficient means of pollination because these insects are very faithful to their individual orchids, and they're unlikely to lose their pollinia on another flower. They'll dollop it straight on the flower of another bee orchid. So very, very clever. I did have a video as well of pseudocopulation, and I know I've gone over, so maybe I could sort of have it on in the background as I sort of close the talk with pseudocopulation in the background. I didn't think this through when I made the talk, that this would be the end, but so I'll just leave you with this wonderful video of these excited insects.